Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. And for those of you who've been here all day, we appreciate you remaining here for what I think will be a really interesting panel. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from my fellow panelists. Let me quickly introduce the panelists. Yehuda Kurtzer is the president of the Shalom Hartman Institute. Dina Kraft is the journalist who covers Israel and the Palestinian territories for the Christian Science Monitor, before that for Haaretz. And Boaz Atzili, my colleague to my immediate right, is my colleague in the Department of Foreign Policy and Global Security here at SIS and AU. And finally, Shmuel Rosner on the other end is a senior fellow at the Jewish People's Policy Institute. Because of time, I'm shortening the bios, but we have fuller bios, more complete bios in the brochures that you guys are holding. And without further ado, I want to begin. First question is about October 7th, of course. The panel of this title is After October 7th, A New Era, Where Are We Now? So my first question is, October 7th was such a defining and traumatic moment for Israel and the Jewish world. What did you make of the responses from the broader U.S. public and within the American Jewish community? And what, if anything, surprised you? I'd like to hear from all four of you. Maybe, Shmuel, we can begin on your end.
I sat here with the clear. Oh, sorry. Okay, so when I think about October 7th, I'm not going to exactly answer your question. I'm going to answer the question I would like to be asked. So when I think about October 7th, what happened in Israel and in the United States, I think about people moving from walking on thick ice to people walking on thin ice. That's the metaphor I have in mind when I think about the Jewish communities. Jews never thought that they were walking on solid ground. We all knew that we had enemies. We all understood that there are challenges ahead of us. And yet we felt that the ice below our feet is solid enough to carry our weight and to let us move forward quite securely. I think the shared experience, and this is something that not all people understand because of the differences, you know, the events in Israel were much more dramatic and deadly and calamitous in their scope. But I think there is a shared experience for both Jewish Israelis and Jewish Americans in the sense that one day they woke up and realized that they were walking on a ground that was much thinner than they thought, and hence that their next step or their desire to move forward must be made in much more cautious way. In many ways, this brought us closer together, Jewish Israelis and Jewish Americans. I see it in public opinion polls that I conduct both in Israel and in the United States. I see that Jews react to questions about the fate of the Jewish people, about the future of Israel and of the American Jewish community in ways that indicate their understanding that we share destiny and that we share a future, and that the ability of Jews to face their challenges is something that they must unite around. I also see it in the way that they think about, you know, about the way they look back inside. In previous panels today, people said that many rabbis see more conversions and more people coming back to the community, and you see this rekindling of a certain Jewish spirit, and you see it both in Israel and here. I'm not saying this is without challenges, but I think this is something, when we look at the big picture, this is something that we need to look at before we delve into the weeds and think about the exact challenges that we might face in both communities.
Thank you. Dina?
Hi, Thanks for that. And thanks for everyone's stamina. I know it's been a really long day, so thank you for being here. I think you asked about sort of what surprised us about the response. I think from afar in Israel, and then going to London shortly after October 7th, was the speed at which empathy and sympathy for Israel vanished or started disappearing very, very quickly. And we saw that on the campuses, even on October 8th, famously. But even among, I think some American Jews, especially younger Jews, there was this sort of the sense from Israelis, at least, of confusion and abandonment. Like, why don't people care specifically, not just about the slaughter, about the hostages, I mean, I was in London and I hadn't even heard any news. This is like 10 days after October 7th, and seeing the signs being thrown, torn down. By the way, there's a new documentary just about that that just came out that looks really good. And why were Israelis so haunted and so horrified by this moment, and how it spoke to in the DNA, I think of the Jewish DNA as well, because these are sort of resonant. This is not the Holocaust, but it was resonant of the Holocaust. Jews being chased down in their own homes and slaughtered. And at the same time, this erasure of Israeli trauma. We know from psychology, one of the hardest things about trauma is when someone does not acknowledge your trauma, right? And I think that was really hard. And also, what we also know about trauma is ongoing trauma is the most difficult form of trauma, and that was the story of the hostages. And we forget that it's just literally 5 weeks ago, I think today, that I stood in Kikal Hatufim in Hostage Square, and as we all saw, in real time, or not quite real time, the hostages, the alive hostages coming back. And I felt like I touched euphoria. It was an incredible moment. And I hope that's a moment that diaspora Jews and Israeli Jews shared. But it really felt like at one point, we saw the Zivi and Gali Berman, the twins, and they were in a helicopter, and it flew over the square not once, but 3 times, and it reminded me of like the Wizard of Oz, everyone coming out to see Glenda the Good Witch, and like looking, oh my God, and people. I hugged so many people that day, and there were so many tears. And my hope now, we're talking also about the future, is like how do we always said in Israel, like when we get the hostages back, we can start healing. We can start becoming a country again. So that's one of my questions, is what will that actually look like now? And also I want to say one of the things that surprised me also is this idea that took hold very quickly in Israel that all Gazans were guilty, no matter who they were. I think we need to talk about that and be honest about that as well.
Thank you, Yehuda.
Great, thank you. This conference has been very useful, actually, because the 2 phenomena that I wanted to speak about were actually implicitly addressed in the first panel this morning with a reflection on history, such that these 2 phenomena that I think were most surprising in terms of how the American Jewish community, which I'll speak about primarily, the kind of surprising elements of the post-October 7th response were actually evocative of earlier moments in American Jewish history. It was just surprising that they reappeared. One of them was the solidarity impulse among American Jews, their institutions, folks who were outside those institutions coming together in acts of solidarity in relationship to Israel, really put a lie to the fears that the American Jewish community and the establishment had for decades leading up to October 7th, which was that we would not have those muscles would have atrophied, and that were there a crisis facing the Jewish people, would the Jewish community be capable of responding? And to use by analogy, Derek Penslar spoke this morning about the 1947, 1948, 1949 United Jewish Appeal campaigns fundraising for Israel, and what they managed to raise in 1948 in a month, which I think the number was $150 million, which is basically the equivalent in 2023 of about $1 billion to $1.5 billion, which American Jews raised in a month after October 7th here. So the muscle around philanthropy, solidarity, the rallies, which exceeded the organizing around Soviet Jewry, all of these were things that American Jewish sociologists would have said for decades were a thing of the past, turned out to have been a muscle that American Jews still could exercise, and turned out that those fears were mistaken. And in fact, in my experience, even going to Israel the week after October 7th and seeing a lot of Israelis, it was very powerful to notice that was less visible to Israelis than the second phenomenon, which emerged after October 7th, which was all surprising, which was, and here's what Sharon Musher talked about in the opening panel as well, the kind of post-67 split in the left, which happened again in 2023, of those who basically de-lefted because of their sense of having been alienated by the left response, as opposed to those who really cemented on the left side of the Jewish community their exit from the Jewish community because of what they perceived as the American Jewish response. So again, we saw a kind of relitigating of the history of this period, and it was striking to me in Israel. A lot of people who I saw in Israel had seen images of 500 left American Jews protesting the war as of October 8th or 9th in Washington, but had seen fewer images of 10,000 Jews gathering in communities across America. And then, of course, they did see the coverage of over 300,000 Jews gathering in Washington. And that told a whole other piece of this story, which I still think is still underdeveloped, which is that the mainstream story was really one of solidarity. There was a parallel story of kind of exit on the left, and mainstream media was far more interested in the left story than it was in the
Man
center
bites
story.
dog.
What's that?
That's the nature of the media.
Of course. The last thing I'll say, though, which I think we'll hopefully talk about some more, is that this turn of events around solidarity, left exit, the redefining of the boundaries of the left, has a really significant impact on what has been an evolving American Jewish agenda, especially among liberal Jews for the past 30 years, which was trying to find more and more ways to open up the tent, so to speak, of Jewish life on a broad agenda of inclusion across different boundaries, which has been mounting in strength really from the 90s until 2022. And the challenge that's emerged over the last 2 years is whether the growing security apparatus for American Jews since October 7th and the growing suspicion inside Jewish communities of who's with us or who's against us is actually going to set back that agenda of inclusion that had been developed by liberal Judaism for so long, and whether there is still possible the future for a kind of big tent agenda for Jewish life.
Thank you, and I think we'll have a chance to unpack some of that in a few minutes. But I want to hear from you, Boaz, and of course, you have a very personal connection and a very personal story to the events on October 7th that perhaps you can begin by sharing.
Yes, so thank you. And I was not here in the morning, so I apologize if I'm saying the same things as some people did. So I have a somewhat different view, and I think two important phenomena. One is that in the general discourse in the US, I think what happened very quickly after October 7, it was not quite surprising, but it was much more in an extreme way that instead of somebody mentioned a dialogue, we basically had a debate club. In a debate club, your goal is to win the argument. For that purpose, you only look at facts that are convenient to you. You don't look at facts that are not convenient to you, to your argument. You don't look at the other side. In this case, both the pro-Palestinian and the from the river to the sea and the pro-Israel, Am Yisrael Chai, were both looking at their side as the victims, but also at their side as the strong side, right? So it's a contradicting, but it doesn't matter because it's a debate. It's not. What strikes me in that is that, in my view, neither of these sides in the debate actually thought about what would be the effects on the people that we care so much about. Right? What would be the effect of shouting all this pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli on the Palestinians or on Israel? In that sense, Israel, as somebody I think said here before, Israel was much more, or is much more, a cause rather than a place. With real people that have an effect, and the same with the pro-Palestinians about the Palestinians. Palestine is a cause. It doesn't quite matter how this approach will affect the people that live in Palestine, particularly in Gaza. What I think really surprised me in the post October 7 In terms of the relations between Israelis and American Jewish community is how much it did not actually change much. That is, there was this terrible massacre in the Israel South. A guy mentioned that. I have a close family who were killed and hostages. There was, in the following 2 years, there was a war of revenge and of, in many cases, of annihilation in Gaza, with probably close to 100,000 people killed and the whole cities razed from the ground. But it didn't quite change the discourse about in the Jewish community about Israel. It made it more extreme, and that's a generalization. There are many people who did not act that way, but basically, some people talked here yesterday and today about the kind of really sad situation where everything becomes political, and even works of art or food is boycotted because of political affiliation. The other side of it is that I think the Jewish community in the U.S., again, generalization, not everybody, a lot of people were not, but definitely the establishment, refuse to see what is very clearly political as a political thing, and the issue of the hostages, I think, is the very clear example of that. So people were very touched by the issues of hostages. They put pictures of the hostages on an empty chair in the synagogue. They donated. They went to rallies, but for all the big Jewish establishment, federations, etc., they refused to do the one thing that was actually going to help release the hostages, which is to speak about it as a political issue and to speak against the government of Israel, which was the main obstacle to getting the hostages back. And I think a lot of people know that this was the case, but it was uncomfortable. It was outside of their comfort zone to speak against the Israeli government. And one example for that, and not even speaking about the Israeli government, right? One example is families of hostages asked in summer of 2024, when the Biden administration put a deal on the table, we asked the federations to just declare that they support a deal, right? Not political in a very strong sense, that they support a deal, right? They refuse to do that. Why? Because it's political. When you don't say something like that, it's also political. Just as political in a way that helped the policy of the government of Israel, and that made the release of the hostages impossible at that time. And that position also had a significant effect on the U.S. administration. I can talk about it later.
So why don't we actually pick up on that and talk about the Gaza war? We've seen 2 years of this devastation you're describing. How has the war impacted, from your perspective, Israel's relationship with the American Jewish community, and how has this impacted public opinion in general here in the U.S.? We're seeing a lot of changes, according to public opinion polls, among both Democrats and Republicans. But maybe first touch upon the kind of divide between the American Jewish community and Israel as you've experienced it.
Yeah, so I think about it a lot. think about the cases of school shooting or mass shootings in the U.S. When you turn these cases to many of the politicians, especially from the right, Republicans, they offer their thoughts and prayers. I think that was the situation with much of the Jewish community regarding the hostages. We offer thoughts and prayers and maybe donations, but refusing to do the one thing that is clearly important to get the hostages out, which is to speak up against Netanyahu and to encourage the political system in the U.S. in that direction. The Biden administration had all the right intentions. They have all the right plans even, but they were reluctant to do them, I think in large part, not only, there's other factors, but in large part because that necessitates speaking publicly against Israel and against the government of Netanyahu, and they fear the backlash. And I think they did some trial balloon. For example, if you remember Schumer's speech in the Senate, that was very clearly trying to make the divide between the good of the Israeli people and the good of the Israeli government. The backlash that he got convinced the Biden administration that we should not, that we should sit back. So they tried to pressure Netanyahu inside the negotiation room in many ways to sign the deal. And Netanyahu, as far as I know, I was not in the room, but from what I know, basically said, many times said, yes, I signed the deal. And then he went outside in the media in Hebrew and made comments that made the deal much harder and especially convinced Hamas to toughen their positions. And then Blinken goes out in the media and says Hamas is the obstacle to the agreement. So I think this is important. If the Jewish community here reflects on this episode, it can see that sometimes it needs to take a tough position politically and to think about really about the good of the people of Israel, about the interests of Israel, even the security interests of Israel, which might not always be the same as the policy of the government of Israel.
Thank you. I think we could just do reverse order here. Go ahead.
Sure. I just want to add one other element to what Boaz had said about why the American Jewish community encodes things as, you know, not political when they're in fact political, and what it means to kind of hold their powder on these things. And I think another way to understand it, and I share the critique that you're offering, another way to understand it is that a lot of American Jewish establishment power, really starting after the Second World War, was premised in relationship to American power as trying to privilege the future of access. Right? The famous story that AIPAC tells about its founding is the delegation of rabbis come to Washington in 1942 to advocate on behalf of the Jews of Europe, and they can get nobody will open their door to them on the Hill or in the White House, and they're left standing outside the cold, and therefore their power in Washington is premised on retaining access. And the fascinating thing that I think has happened over the years is that they take the same approach with respect to the Israeli government, meaning our job is always to have access, always to have a respective the opportunity of an audience, when in fact that's a place where actually the American Jewish community will always in some ways have access and has never decided to actually use its leverage. So it's an interesting piece of that story as well. Look, the obvious place where the war, beyond the immediate trauma of October 7th, has wreaked havoc on the American Jewish community as well as on American Jews more generally within the American polity is, as Dina alluded to before, a kind of squandering of moral capital that happened relatively quickly, but certainly with the kind of prolonged war and the insistence by the State of Israel and by its supporters of retaining support for the war at all costs, even when public opinion in Israel had begun to shift around the war, even it was becoming clearer and clearer that there were political motivations for the perpetuation of the war, and a kind of absolute refusal to engage with any of those discussions. And the place where we see the majority of that impact in the American political sphere is usually described around young people and the left. And you see the consequences of it in America, not only in American politics, but in the American Jewish community's relationship to American politics, especially in the Democratic Party. As a Democratic Party operative said to me on a podcast a few weeks ago, it's impossible to imagine the election of Zohran Mamdani in the biggest Jewish city in the world were it not for 2 years of the Gaza war. Simply a normalizing of a totally different political culture was really only possible because of 2 years of the Gaza war. The great miscalculation, though, that I think is taking place in Jewish communities, and it really goes back now almost 20 years, the Prime Minister of Israel a long time ago had basically concluded that liberal American Jews were more of a hassle than an asset, believed the language he had heard from American Jewish sociologists over time that American Jews were disappearing, and instead said, well, I'll just gamble on, instead of having 2 or 3 million very annoying liberal American Jews who are probably not on my side anyway on any issue, I'm going to gamble on 100 million plus evangelicals and develop their support for Israel. I think the most surprising, and in some ways not surprising, turn of events really that we see in the last year, which I think is also because of the endurance of the Gaza war, is the erosion of support for Israel among young Americans on the right. And this is proving to be a very significant miscalculation because in this context, a strong relationship with liberal American Jews could have been an asset over time to try to ensure that the Jewish community is somewhat united in its front to try to build endurance of bipartisan support for Israel. So the kind of turning away from liberal Jews on one hand and losing a lot of their attachment to Israel because of Israeli policy is now, has now eliminated a potential lever in the erosion of that support on the American right. And it's not because the folks on the American right are angry that Israel, continued the war the way it did. It's just that it strikes the perpetuation of this war with visual American support for Israel, with a tremendous amount of money going to Israel in the middle of a time of kind of economic fear and instability in America, is raising a set of questions that used to be left questions but are now right questions, like, should America continue to be investing all of this capital in Israel? Should we be pursuing a very different strategy in relationship to the Middle East? So I think the obvious story is what's happened on the left side of American Jews and the Jewish community, but I think it's a more complicated story to see the consequences on the American right.
Dina.
Thanks. I think it's really important what you both mentioned about the sort of impact of the sort of American Jews taking a back seat when it comes to being political and not wanting to touch the fire of Netanyahu, even though you have so many Israelis in the streets week after week after week for 2 years plus, first with the democracy movement and then with the movement to free the hostages and bring them home and get a deal, to sort of like turn a blind eye to them almost, or a blind ear, to say it was political. And it's interesting, I think, in part maybe that's because less American Jews have skin in the game compared to some other diaspora Jews, because I was traveling this summer in Australia and New Zealand and having very intense conversations about what was happening on the ground in Israel and what the Gaza war looked like and felt like on the ground. And I felt that the Australian and New Zealand Jews, because so many of them have relatives who live in Israel or have spent time in Israel, because they're more sort of hardcore Zionists, it was easier for them to have a discussion, an honest discussion, than I think in some American Jewish communities, which can be more reactionary and more defensive. I also found among some American Jewish friends, they were like, oh, I don't want to hear about Netanyahu again. I know you're suffering under him. I know that the Israeli people feel like they are hostage to Netanyahu, but we have enough on our plate to deal with all the backlash and anti-Semitism. It was interesting. There was one point, I think it was perhaps after the shooting and the Israeli diplomat couple that were shot and killed here tragically in Washington. On Channel 12, there was actually data showing that anti-Semitic attacks had gone up in America after ceasefires were broken. But there is a connection. And that was important, I think, for an Israeli audience to see that, because that's something that's not discussed that much in Israel. I also just want to point out about, we talk a lot about in this conference and in general on this topic about the younger generation. Well, they're seeing something very different. They're seeing on their Instagram and they're seeing on their social media and they're seeing in the media writ large stories of Gaza and the suffering on the ground. You talk about this war of revenge. You talk about this entire strip being flattened and the incredible death toll. And that's something that Israeli Jews were not seeing in the media by design. And that's another sort of the conversation. And sometimes I would ask myself, but why don't Israelis Google Gaza? It's not that hard to find out what's happening. But I think it's also a lot to ask of a people who are, completely, in a sense of trauma and setting off their sons to the army and very fully involved in the mobilization around Gaza, to also be media literate in another language. But I think we need to talk about that as well, and sort of the seeing different screens and seeing different worldviews.
I'm surprised by the way this discussion turned from analysis to advocacy, and I have to take issue with what all three other panelists said up until now, and I'll try to make it brief by making three comments. As much as I hate to be the advocate for the government of Israel, which I totally dislike. I do want to begin to go back to the premise of illegitimate government. Mr. Netanyahu is not a dictator. He is the legitimate leader of Israel, elected by the people, supported by a majority in the parliament. His majority is actually larger today than what it used to be. As much as I'm unhappy about this situation, that is the situation in Israel. And Israel is, the decisions made by the Israeli government are decisions that are completely legitimate, even though there is a debate within Israel to expect the American Jewish community to go after an Israeli government because of the dislike of one person or someone else, because you think that their ability to decide for Israel is lesser than the ability of people who sit in Washington or New York. I think that's a preposterous idea. Let me add, in addition to this statement, that I think that on principle, American Jews should not intervene and should not try to dictate to any Israeli government what it ought to do on matters of war and peace that are highly controversial, highly complicated. I think that in practice, those of us who are familiar with the history of the relations between Israel and American Jewry should know that whenever the American Jewish community tried to impose its will on Israel, the result was miserable. There was backlash. The Israeli public did not tolerate it. The Israeli majority resented the attempt by American Jews to interfere in Israeli affairs. And again, in this conference we hear many viewpoints, but I must say, and this is something to think about maybe for the future, we don't get to hear the voice of the majority of the Israeli public. I do not represent it. I don't think anyone on this panel represents it. I don't think anyone in today's discussions represented it. There is a majority in Israel that supported the initiation of the war, that supported the current government, that is still supportive of many of the goals that the government presented as the end goals of the war, including elimination of Hamas, including a nasty battle. I don't think it's a war of revenge. I think it is a war of defense for Israel. I think it is a nasty war. And to what you said, that Israelis don't much see on TV the suffering of Gazans. They don't, but it's not as if, it's not that they don't want, that they don't know what's going on in Gaza. Israelis are well connected to the news. They understand what's going on. They know, they see what's happening in Gaza. And it's not that they don't know, it's that they don't care. Now, you might criticize them for not caring. You might want them to care more, but they have reasons not to care. It's not out of ignorance that they don't care about what's happening in Gaza. And it's not because of ignorance that they say that all Gazans are in some way responsible for the calamity of October 7th, or that there are no innocents in Gaza. They say it for a reason, and the reason is the reality that they encountered on October 7th and October 8th, and what soldiers saw in Gaza day after day as they were entering neighborhoods and homes, and as they were meeting with Gazans, with Hamas fighters, as they were interrogating Gazans that were detained by Israel. The idea or the tendency to say that Gazans are all responsible for October 7th isn't come, it's not a pie in the sky. It's something that comes out of reality. And this reality that Israelis are well aware of is something that we need to acknowledge. We cannot just say, well, Israelis don't know or don't care or don't watch it on TV or are ruled by a dictatorship or whatever type of thing that I heard here. Or now Israelis are even responsible for the decision by New Yorkers to elect Mamdani as their mayor. You know, that's the kind of self-blame that Israelis would justly reject.
Yeah, I think Yehuda has a response, so.
No, okay. No. I do not expect my comments to be popular with the rest of the panel.
I just think you mischaracterized them. It's not that, you know, first of all, I don't think this is a difference between advocacy here and analysis here. Applying a critical lens to what we see as part of analysis. You might disagree with it, but it's a critical analysis. I think I want to be, maybe I'll be more precise. There are impacts created by the war in Gaza on American politics and on the American Jewish community. For the American Jewish community, which is a place where I sit, and as an American citizen, and as a New York City voter, my relationship to those issues involves my applying a critical lens to that with the right of being a stakeholder as both in the American Jewish community about how my leaders operate, and with a right as an American to weigh in on what the American political response should be here. To say that I am impacted by these events that take place in Israel is not saying to you, you as an Israeli voter should necessarily take into consideration what we as Americans or American Jews are going to have as part of our lives because of the war. You can decide not to care about it. That's perfectly legitimate. It doesn't mean that I'm not a stakeholder.
But you assume that the Israeli government didn't take this into account,
No,
and I might say,
I didn't say
well,
anything to
they
that
might
effect.
weigh the issues differently than you do.
100%.
Okay.
So I wanted to actually touch upon something Dina said a little earlier about the generational divide, because we've seen this on this campus, we've seen this on other campuses throughout the country, and you mentioned social media as perhaps a factor, explaining why is it that we're seeing such a generational divide among Jews, but also among Democrats and even Republicans. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about what you think is driving it. Is it just social media? Is it podcasters? What is it about the Gaza war that has fueled and perhaps intensified a trend that we've been seeing for a while?
So I'm based in Tel Aviv, so I'm less sort of finger on the pulse exactly what's, you know, happening here, what people are watching and breathing. But I do observe it, you know, on my own feed and whatnot. I mean, I think there's just, you know, it's a very complex topic in a lot of ways, and people sort of now they're now diving headfirst into it. and it becomes sort of like the cause célèbre of the time. But it's also but I think, and it's easy to dismiss it as, oh, they don't. On the other hand, it's easy to sort of dismiss young people as, oh, they don't know what they're talking about, they have no background in this. But they also see what they see, which they see as mass suffering, And I think it sort of has to be sort of addressed as, you could say that there's military reasons for that mass suffering. You can also, I speak to a lot of military experts and former generals who would argue that after January 2024, it was diminishing returns, militarily in Gaza, and this was sort of a more political war being waged, and you could disagree or agree about that. But the bottom line is they are, you have comedians, and you have actors, and you have all these celebrities, and you have all these sort of influencers trying to break things down in sometimes very facile ways, right? But there also does feel like there's this. They're seeing this disaster play out in front of them, and they're genuinely alarmed and disturbed by it, and I think that's worth addressing. I think what's interesting when you think about the generational divide of what I see in Israel, of young people in Israel, they're the ones who are the most impacted by the war, right? Whether you were the generation of soldiers going out to fight on October 7th and in the last 2 years, or whether you were the young people, the 20-something, the 30-somethings who were slaughtered at Nova. I mean, this is sort of the war of their generation, and this is like a pivotal time for them. And this is also a generation that over the years has been shifting more and more rightward. They have no living memory of Oslo and the peace talks and Rabin. What they have memories of are, several Gazan wars, 2009, 2014, 2021, 2023. For them, going down to the bomb shelter is part of the, touchstones of their life, and they've lost so many friends, and and that's something. All that's sort of been interesting is we're seeing now a whole slew of different studies about Israelis turning more towards spirituality and religion after October 7th, which is in part a trauma response, right? And interestingly, it's been led in some ways by the stories of hostages themselves. The Israeli media, which doesn't always love to show stories of religion, has been quite fascinated by the story, I think you'll agree, of the hostages.
I'm publishing a new study on this phenomenon tomorrow.
Oh, wow, we should talk. Okay. So it's really, really, I mean, we'd love to hear your insights about the study, but it's been really interesting sort of seeing, there's several studies have come out, but including from young people about this. And the hostages themselves, they came from a place, many of them were secular, and all of a sudden you had like the story, for example, of Or Levy, who was like looking at a crack in the wall in the ceiling and in the tunnels, and all of a sudden it occurred to him, maybe that was God. And he starts having a conversation with God through this like crack in the ceiling. And you talk to hostages who started blessing the wine on Friday night with just water, and hostages who started observing Shabbat. Some who refused to eat non-kosher meats because the meat in the Gaza was not going to be kosher. And I'm actually ghostwriting the book of Emily Damari right now. One of the hostages who's returning, and she very much feels that that she survived for a reason, and that God chose her to also be sort of someone who could talk about this and survive it, but also talk about it and share the story afterwards. And so these young people, these young Israelis, are having a very different experience than their counterparts in America.
And that's another part of this generational divide, that while we're seeing more and more American Jews move to the left compared to the older generations, their parents, their grandparents, we're seeing the opposite in Israel, where, as you said, the young people basically grew up with Netanyahu. They don't know other prime ministers. They don't know other leaders.
But they also grew up now with this foundational trauma of October 7th. And for them, it's not abstract, the idea of protecting the homeland. For them, it's about protecting their mothers and their fathers and their grandparents and their homes.
Shmuel, maybe you can give us an early preview of your...
You want preview from the study? So the study... We conducted a poll in Israel of all Israeli society, Jewish and Arab, and another poll of what we call the soldiers' generation, youngsters from 18 to 25. And the basic idea was to look at trends of, it's traditionality / religiosity. It's a tricky in American setting to talk about Israeli traditionality. In Israel, Judaism is not a religion. In Israel, Judaism is something else. It's not only a religion. It's been mentioned in previous panels. I will not expand on it, but generally speaking, what we found, And you're right. We found that there is a general trend towards more traditional tendencies. So people say they believe in God more than before the war. People say they practice more Jewish traditions than before the war, etc. And we find it in different ways, both concerning beliefs, practices, and views. However, and there is an important however here, as Israel moves towards more tradition, it is also becoming somewhat more polarized on tradition. And this is because one segment of the population, the largest group, which is the group of secular Jewish Israelis, is moving away from tradition. So on the one hand, you see all the people that were mentioned here, hostages, etc. These are mostly people who belong to the group that we call traditional non-religious Israelis. In Israel, if you go by the Bureau of Statistics way of dividing the Jewish population, you have 5 groups. You have secular, you have non-religious traditional people, somewhat religious traditional people, and then the 2 groups of religious people, religious and ultra-religious, the Haredi groups. The divide between the 2 groups of non-religious people, the secular and the traditional non-religious, this is where you see the divide. The strictly secular, the totally secular, are moving somewhat away from tradition. They believe in God less, they practice less, they feel more distant from Jewishness because of the war and because of the political divide. All other Israelis are moving towards a more conservative, more traditional thinking about their culture. And that's why, again, when you look at Israel as a whole, you will see a society becoming more traditional. When you look at the division within Israel, you'll see a challenge. You'll see a challenge that is becoming even more of a challenge because of our political reality. We know that the challenge exists not only because of traditionality, but also because of all the things that we had before the war. The divisions within Israeli society were not created by the war, they were exacerbated by the war, and this is something that we have to keep in mind. Israel was not becoming polarized because of the war, it was becoming polarized before the war. For a very short period of time, we thought that we are going to overcome our divisions to united against a common enemy. We did unite against the common enemy, but the divisions stayed below the surface and resurfaced fairly quickly after the start of the war.
Boaz, you want
So about the younger generation, I like to think about myself as younger. So I think that there are several processes that may be going on here, and just kind of my general knowledge. It's not my area of expertise or something. I think one of them is that the younger Jewish generation is much less connected to institutions. So does not mean that they are less Jewish, but it means that they're less connected to the Jewish institutions, and fewer of them are going to synagogue, etc. So some of this kind of, I think, custom that you kind of leave your liberalism aside when you come to synagogue, when it comes to Israel, does not apply to them. So they, I think, look at this in a way that is much more similar to the general population of their generation, and what the general population see, especially on the liberal side, on the left side, they see that in terms of like victimhood, it's asymmetric, regardless of whether there are justification for the attacks in Gaza or for the specific ways of attacks in Gaza. It's very much asymmetric, right? There was one day and maybe one day of a massacre and a couple of weeks of a little bit of asymmetric fighting, and beyond that, it's very asymmetrical. So, and they see that so it's clear. So they might tend to kind of move them in one direction. The other thing is, as mentioned, social media. So as people see take their news from Instagram or TikTok. So first of all, it's short, it's sound bites, and it's by necessity simplistic. As I said, it's like a debate. You have to pick sides. You can't go to complexities. And that creates a situation where you have to pick sides. A lot of your friends are in that side, so you're going to pick that side. Even since a lot of this is also in TikTok, TikTok is in some ways, not directly, but there are some influences of who make TikTok, China, and that may affect the way their algorithm is working and what kind of news they get as well. So I think that has something to do with that. So I think these are kind of like the two things that might affect this divide. But I have to say that in my classes, and I'm not in this last couple of years teaching directly Arab-Israeli conflict or something like that, but I'm teaching courses on international security and territorial conflict, and so the Arab-Israeli conflict comes out a lot. And what I see mostly in my classes, and that might be somewhat a result of like self-selection of who comes to your classes, who takes the classes. What I see is not so much a polarization and extreme views, but I see a lot of students that just don't want to talk about it. It's like it becomes like third grade. They will be happy to talk about India, Pakistan, or about Russia, Ukraine, or about anything like that. But when it comes to issues of Israel-Palestine or Israel-Arab relations, they prefer to stay quiet. I think part of it is the fear of being branded as you are this or you are that, and somebody will take a picture and put it on Instagram without context, and you'll be ostracized. Part of it is just that they maybe feel they don't know enough, and it's so polarizing, so they just don't want to talk about it. And I'm talking about American University, where a significant part of our body of interest are Jewish students, right? Maybe 20% or so are Jewish students. So that's kind of like, and it's, I'm concerned about this trend, because if you don't talk about something, you cannot get to real discussion and to a discourse that can lead somewhere.
Well, as I have a feeling that our students here are going to be interested in talking about it. We'll find out in a few minutes. But I'd like to hear your thoughts, Yehuda.
Yeah. So, just to build a little bit on what Boaz said, there's actually a social scientist at Tulane, Ilana Horowitz, who published a piece in JTA, actually, a few weeks ago, in which she also kind of polled her Jewish students about their taking Jewish studies classes and their overwhelming disinterest. And then she did some research with other peers who are teaching Jewish studies classes elsewhere in the country. Overwhelming disinterest in talking about Israel-Palestine or about anti-Semitism. And it's very striking, since that's what everyone else is talking about. But her argument is that, yeah, those things are connected. Students are saturated with content on Israel-Palestine, with stuff around anti-Semitism. It is what their parents overwhelmingly want them to be focused on and engaged with, but they are actually searching out, really for the first time in many ways, Jewish content in university classrooms and elsewhere that is precisely not about those topics because they're saturated by it and because the social consequences of engaging around Israel-Palestine and around anti-Semitism issues are really quite significant. It's something we've also seen in our work with teens. We had a group of 350 teens from across the country together for a weekend a few weekends ago, and I asked them at the end of the weekend, how many of you in high school have experienced some version of social consequences because of the war? And 325 out of 350, from Jewish day schools to public schools to private and independent schools, had raised their hand and said that they did. So that's the climate in which they're in which they're living. But the responses are a little bit strange. It doesn't mean necessarily that they're growing distant from the Jewish community. They just may be searching for something different in university classrooms and elsewhere, precisely because of those issues. I also just want to annotate that we in the Jewish community especially tend to focus on the quote-unquote the young people who are getting away, right? Those who are like turning away from the Jewish community and its institutions. By the way, that's a every generation phenomenon, right? This is, and especially 22 to 40 historically are just not high levels of affiliation. And it's not because people have the wrong politics, it's because they don't really need the Jewish community the way that it's institutionally designed, which is really premised around families, and people in their late 30s and 40s begin to find the Jewish community again. So it's a kind of an evergreen, recurring phenomenon. We do tend to focus on that sector that has this trenchant critique, either angry about the Jewish community's attitudes on Israel or alienated from the Jewish community's attitudes on Israel. And we tend to focus a lot less on the sectors of the same demographic that are growing more attached to the Jewish people and to the state of Israel. That is certainly the case in the Orthodox community in America, especially post-October 7th. It was alluded to this morning's panel as well. Those are very fast-growing sectors of the Jewish community in America. Again, I think there really is very significant media bias around which stories of breakdown within the Jewish community are worthy of not just Jewish media, but national media attention. Stories of attachment are considered less interesting than stories of detachment. So like, even though we've seen a spike in conversions, even though from October 7th through the end of that whole semester, Hillel's reported more students attending Shabbat dinners than they'd ever seen. Even though we saw a crazy spike in the 23 to 2024 in people wanting to work in Jewish organizations among all ages. I mean, these are fascinating trends, but the story that's been most interesting is the story of who's leaving as a result of this. And I think there's a lot of psychological reasons why I know why the media gravitates towards them. I think there are also psychological reasons why the Jewish community gravitates towards those stories, because they speak to a fear that we won't have a future. They're continuity issues, right? And that's that fear. And because I think the critics of the Jewish community among young people who are leaving the Jewish community over-index as people who come from highly affiliated families. So therefore, I know it sounds strange, but like, if you are the kid of a rabbi and have decided then to stand against the politics of your community, that's like a double loss, right? You haven't just left the community, you've left from that sector of the community that thought it had kind of permanent continuity. So there's a reason to over-index on them, but I don't think it actually tells the expansive story of all of the complicated ways in which young Jews are evolving in relationship to Israel, Jewish peoplehood, and anti-Semitism. I think we would have to do that a lot more systematically than is currently being done.
Dina, please.
Can I just add to that, the sort of a parallel among Israeli young people, or in general, this sort of attraction to spirituality and to Judaism, and the numbers in some ways going up, is that you were seeing a surge in requests for bar mitzvahs. I interviewed somebody recently from Tzoal, which is an Israeli organization of modern Orthodox rabbis that try to bring in other segments of Israeli society into Jewish tradition, and they've had a surge in Jewish weddings. Even those people who were married before, but were married perhaps in civil weddings abroad, they want to be married Jewishly now. And a surge in young Jews going to lessons, Yom Kippur services, the demand going up. You hear there's a sort of notion of hitraskut among young people. So that's, and I think it's also how it's been explained to me, at least by some analysts, is that it's about the failure of Zionism as they see it as well. If Zionism was about protecting the Jewish people, October 7th was something that was never supposed to happen. That brought them back to like the darkest corners of Jewish history. And so if you're not just Israeli, if you're just not Zionist, what are you? You're also Jewish. Then you're looking to infuse that Judaism with meaning, and that's going back to tradition in some ways. And interestingly, you have some sort of kind of quirky things happening, like young men wearing tzitzit, but not wearing kippot, like they're sort of picking and choosing. And you see a lot of people like going into like the other day at the train station, all these secular people like kissing the mezuzah, and some of that's also sort of more spirituality than actual Judaism, but it's an interesting kind of parallel
this
phenomenon.
will soon become a law in Israel, that you have to kiss the mezuzah.
I want to go back to the divides.
Let me
and
just say that it's so comforting to me to strongly agree with Yehuda on something. I think
We
that
literally just met. It's okay.
I think that the distancing of young American Jews from Israel had been overstated for decades now. I'm not saying there are no young people who distance themselves from Israel. Most of them just distance themselves from everything. They distance themselves from Judaism and from Israel and from many other things. And, it's something that we'd have to live with. But by and large, if you look at the American Jewish community in the last 20, 30 years, and I've been covering these issues for the last 30 years, you keep hearing about distancing, and you look at the numbers, and the numbers are in many ways stable. American Jews, by and large, feel connected to Israel, care about the future of Israel, want Israel to thrive and survive, and are highly critical of certain Israeli politics, policies, and governments.
So this is actually a good segue to my last question before I open it up to the audience, which is, what do you think, any of you think, of the kind of blind spots or maybe just misunderstandings that American Jews have of Israelis and vice versa? Since you've been covering it for 30 years, maybe we start with you.
American Jews and Israeli Jews cannot understand each other. They live in completely different worlds and in completely different circumstances. And I think one of the things that we keep doing wrongly is to expect American Jews to become more like Israeli Jews, or to expect Israeli Jews to become more like American Jews. These constant complaints that we hear on both sides. Why can't you be more like us? It's because we live in different worlds and have different circumstances. And our Jewish culture is something that evolves in certain circumstances. It's not a Platonic idea up in the air. You have certain circumstances on which you build a culture. And Israeli Jewish culture is very different from American Jewish culture, and that's the way it should be. There's no other way. So I think rather than expecting each other to change or thinking that something is wrong on the other side because they do things differently, we need to understand that in different countries and in different environments, something that we call by the same name, Jewish culture, is essentially different. Jewish culture in Israel is very much tends to connect to the sense of nationality and Israeli patriotism. And what's the most Jewish thing that a person in Israel can do? To serve in the IDF. That's the answer you get from most Jewish Israelis, except for the ultra-Orthodox who do not serve. For all other Jewish Israelis, the thing that ranks highest as a Jewish deed is to serve in the IDF. Not to serve in the IDF, that's a civil duty. It's not a religious practice. But within the Israeli context, it is something that people can relate to as Jewish practice. Author, novelist A.B. Yoshua, famous, he used to enrage Jewish Americans by saying, derogatory things about them. But he would say that, when you pave a road in Israel, that's a Jewish thing that you do. When you plant a tree in Israel, that's a Jewish thing that you do. That's the essence of Jewishness in Israel. And in America, it must be different. So, what we don't understand about each other, we don't understand that we must be very different in order to preserve Jewish culture under the circumstances in which we find ourselves.
It's not really. Let me just push back for a minute on that, because
Sure.
when American Jews hear statements by Smotrich or Ben Gvir that are antithetical to everything they believe Judaism is about, regardless of whether Ben Gvir speaks for Ben Gvir or for more Israelis, there is kind of a sense of there might be more than just different cultures here. There might be different values. And
Ben Gvir and Smotrich together represent 15% of the Jewish population. They do not represent Israel. They have extreme views within Israeli society that sometimes we can, debate, and sometimes we just must tolerate because coexistence is important. I rarely agree with any of the things that they say, but they represent a certain Jewish view that, okay, it's out there. I hear views of Jewish Americans that I don't accept or don't agree with. I would not assume that all Jewish Americans agree with the most extreme views of certain groups within the American Jewish community. Do I think that Ben Gvir and Smotrich have a voice that is too dominant in Israeli society today? The answer is yes. I would rather them to represent a smaller minority. But, that's life. I cannot, I don't...
They are senior members, though, of the government.
They're
not just random
They
people.
are members of the government. I don't know what senior means today. There's one senior member of the Israeli government. That's Prime Minister Netanyahu. Seriously, all other members of the government are just small players that he can consult with or disregard as he pleases. That's the way Israeli politics is done today. Again, they represent a voice in Israel that I disagree with and that people reject for good reasons, but they don't represent Israeli Judaism as a culture. Israeli Judaism is much wider than Ben Gvir and Smotrich, and you shouldn't give them you shouldn't consider them the dominant voice of Israeli Judaism when it's not.
Dina and then
Yeah.
Boaz.
I agree they're not the dominant voice, but they've been given, disproportionate microphones, and loudspeakers because of the positions that they were given by Netanyahu in the government. And there's consequences to that, including in The Hague potentially, because they're cherry-picking their quotes and whatnot to back up the arguments of, that Israel's committing genocide.
I hate that you force me to be the advocate of the Israeli government that I dislike much more than you do, because it's. But then again, they live in Israel. They're entitled to have their opinions.
But I like to say, it does trickle down. Like you see Ben Gvir, he's in charge of the police, and you see the police brutality, against protesters. Even just 2 weeks ago, there was a brawl outside of a soccer game. The Maccabi Tel Aviv versus their rivals Tel Aviv, Hapoel Tel Aviv, and because Hapoel Tel Aviv is perceived as the left-wing soccer team, even if not all of the members, not all the fans or so, they were like hounded and beaten and called terrorists and Hamasnikim, by the police, and so that's.
We often tend to confuse ideology with incompetence. Ben Gvir is mostly incompetent. He's a bad minister of internal security. He's a bad minister of the police. The police under him is just not good.
But there are major consequences, including the homicide rate in the Arab community,
etc. Of course,
and other places.
Incompetence has consequences.
For sure. But apropos to your question about the divide, and sort of things with blind spots, it was referred to last night too, but there was an Eretz Nederet, which is the Israeli version of Saturday Night Live, had a sketch recently of two old friends that meet at Ben Gurion at the airport. Jennifer from America and Eli from Israel. Did you see this? And it kind of in some ways sums up the difference, the sort of blind spots of each other is how vulnerable Israelis feel and how vulnerable Americans feel, and not necessarily seeing each other's vulnerabilities. So Eli, they bump into each other with their suitcases at the airport. And they realize that they both agree, one day you just wake up and you realize your country just isn't the same anymore. And they agree on that. And they realize, that Jennifer is moving to Israel and Ellie is moving to New York. and she said, and he says, what are you moving to Israel now? It's crazy, Ellie says to her. And she says to him, Jennifer says to Ellie, you're going to New York? What are you, crazy? And Jennifer says, trust me, you just don't understand. It's not safe anymore in New York. And Ellie says, you're literally coming to the most dangerous place on the planet for Jews? And they walk away cursing each other as being idiots. So that's a little snapshot.
So if you can keep your comments very brief, just because I want to make sure we have enough time for Q&A.
Yeah, I'll just say briefly, I share that these communities don't have to mirror each other. They do have to understand each other, and they do have to use some notion of Jewish peoplehood to at least find sympathetic ways to understand the needs of the others in the idiom in which it's expressed. I had a version of this that's been most frustrating to me in trying to communicate with Israelis was best exemplified by a conversation with a colleague who actually does know the Jewish community in America, even though he's Israeli. And at some point we were talking about, I expressed that even as I fear the normalization of what I consider dangerously anti-Israel, anti-Zionist viewpoints, I object to the extra-legal seizing of Americans on American soil by masked officers, citizen or non-citizen, regardless of whether they happen to harbor these kind of views. And the person said to me, okay, well, I know it's a violation of civil rights, but, and I was like, let me stop you there. I was like, that's the whole thing for many American Jews, and it's not because we're assimilated. It's because we actually have a narrative about how liberal democracy is vital to the security of Jews within this project that Israelis have a very different narrative about. The Israelis' relationship to what keeps you safe is fundamentally different, and I'm not convinced that the American model needs to be imposed on Israel, and I'm quite certain that the Israeli model shouldn't be imposed on America. And I find that if we can find ways to bridge that conversation, we emerge at a very different political, cultural, geographic milieus, and our narration of what we consider essential to our safety and security has to at least be understood by the other instead of being made into kind of a straw man of like, well, you obviously don't understand what it means to keep the Jewish people safe.
Okay, Boaz, do you want to?
Yeah, very briefly, I think what the blind spot for American Jews on Israel is, I think, the degree to which the Israeli society is on a fast track to authoritarian society and regime. Yes, there are elections. There are elections also in Turkey and in Iran. That doesn't mean that it's keeping democracy is not only elections, and we see in this country what democratically elected president is doing in ways that are undemocratic, and in Israel it's on steroid. And it's very much related to the war. Under the fog of war, the anti-democratic actions have been increased, and I think American Jews don't quite realize where it goes. And so, where is there a point where American Jews would hesitate to say, I'm supporting Israel if Israel is so and so. Maybe it's not there yet, but is there a point like that? And I think from the other side, yeah, Israeli Jews don't understand a lot of what what's going on with American Jews. On the Israeli liberal side, I would also say that they're simply exhausted from the last 2 years, or more than 2 years, 2.5 years, of fighting in the street for again for defending their democracy, for the hostages to come back, for ending the war. They're simply exhausted to the degree that they don't have much bandwidth to deal with anything else. That includes thinking significantly about American Jewry.
Okay, thank you. Great comments, very insightful, but I do want to give students, we have a tradition of giving students first opportunity. So go ahead and identify yourself and let us know who your questions are.
Hello, my name is Joshua, and I'm a first-year political science student here. And I guess circling back to, American Jewish relations with Israel and the American political system, you see legacy Jewish organizations burn a lot of credibility with the new ascendant, sort of Mamdani-ish left wing of the Democratic Party, and also not really adapting to the new ascendant Groyper-ish, like Tucker Carlson wing of the Republican Party. I guess, so my question is, how can liberal American Jews and American Jewish legacy organizations rebuild ties with the new sort of ascendant wings of power in both the Democratic and Republican parties?
Okay, should we?
Why don't you take a couple and then?
Yeah, let's do that. Let's take a few and then.
It was an interesting question, though. Yeah.
David, are you going around with the microphone?
I have also.
Oh, we have. Okay, great.
My name is Caroline. I'm a student. I'm a senior at American University. I am one of Professor Ziv's students, and I was wondering.
Be a good question.
I was wondering, as an American Jew without strong ties, cultural ties or otherwise, to Judaism, what have you specifically, Professor Boaz, found to be the most effective way to depoliticize a conversation in order to not necessarily bring, specifically on topics of Israeli-Palestinian issues, how do you depoliticize that conversation in order to understand the other better?
Great. Maybe we'll take one more question and then.
Hey, Jack Bosshart, political science student, American student of Professor Brenner. Just wanted to say, first of all, thanks for being here, and really loved the discourse and debate. I've been to a few panels, and this is kind of what I was hoping for, so I really liked hearing the exchange of ideas. That being said, Shmuel,
You disagree with me.
No, my question isn't going to be about disagreement. It's going to be more like, you talk about how Israeli voters who make up this legitimate government don't have to care about the plight of American Jews or the rise of anti-Semitism. If that's the case, then why should American Jews care about the plight of Israel and Israeli Jewish life?
Okay, we have some thought-provoking and provocative questions. Who wants to take this on first?
I'll take the first question about American
Tucker Carlson and
American
Reuters.
Jewish institutions. Look, from a historical standpoint, what made it work for the Jewish community in the second half of the 20th century was not necessarily the creation of the Jewish community. It was a set of political conditions that American Jews inherited, especially following the Second World War, of a broad culture of bipartisanship, which was viewed as being part and parcel of what made America strong, and especially in antithesis to the Russians. And it enabled the American Jewish community to thrive within that context. It has been the worrying trend globally, and as it's played out in America proper, has been the way in which extreme partisanship has divides our politics and risks placing the Jews on the inverse side of the ascendant politics, whether it's on the right or the left. The biggest mistake that I have watched the American Jewish community make over the past 20 years has been embracing the culture of hyperpolarization as opposed to resisting it. And the reason American Jews did this was because we became Americans. And American Jews, like Isaiah Berlin says, Jews are like everybody else, but more so. American Jews simply imitate the larger political trends that Americans are inhabiting. So as Democrats and Republicans are in this division around our political identities in ways that don't serve us, American Jews have basically been participating in that project, and it erodes our capacity to think about the fighting of anti-Semitism and a baseline support for Israel as a shared collective concern. Now, what that means is now the legacy institutions have found themselves in a bind in exactly the way that you described. What I would love to see for legacy American Jewish institutions is a lot less saving a lot of their powder from what they do currently, which is performing outrage against this politician or that politician, a lot less use of the media to kind of name and shame what they like and what they don't like, and to get back to the business that the American Jewish community should be doing, which is of building muscle and power within the Jewish community as to support the presence of Jews in America as a collective concern. Now that means also one of those pieces is building more effective coalitions, and that means, yes, outreach to the parts of the Democratic Party where it may not like some of its politicians, but where individuals are not the same as their politicians. And that's going to be true on the right as well. And that means thinking of our politics as a collective concern rather than as a kind of a partisan concern. And most importantly, it means that the focus of American Jewish institutions today should be about retaining the core infrastructure and institutions of liberal democracy in America. Not always talking about we want this politician to be pro-Israel, but talking about the ways in which the fabric of liberal democracy actually is the ultimate mechanism by which American Jews are going to be safe in America. That means that the majority of American Jewish institutional work should be below the surface. And I think that there are perverse incentives right now for American Jewish leadership to think that that work is actually out in public, when in fact all of that work erodes the very power that the American Jewish establishment has accumulated for so long.
Boaz, did you want to respond?
Yeah, Caroline, okay. A really good question. I would say, first of all, that I don't think we should make questions apolitical. I think these questions are inherently political. Basically, the way at least I think about political, anything that has to do with the distribution of power and resources is political. And so definitely the war in Gaza is political. Everything about it is Israel-Palestine is political, and that's not a bad thing. I think that what we ought to do, we don't do enough as a university, we don't do enough in general, but also when we do it, it's kind of hard to do it, is to bring students to listen to things that they might not agree with, to listen to, for example, just as an example, we had an event last week that showed two movies, one about Israeli hostages and one about Gaza, short movies from Gaza. That's so people would see the other side, would see that there's more than actually two sides, that issues are complicated, that it's not either or, that there's the good guys and the bad guys, and I'm deciding who's the good and who's the bad, and I'm not listening to the other side. So the idea is working on just exposure to arguments and thoughts from very different sides, and trying to think about how things might be complex and not easy to just if you think that an issue has a very clear black and white, right or wrong, think again then.
Yeah, I'll answer the question that was addressed to me. I'm afraid that I was misunderstood. It's probably due to my bad accent. I was not saying that Israel should not take into consideration the way its actions implicate American Jews or anti-Semitism in the world, etc. All I was saying is that when a country goes to war, and on October 7th, Israel didn't even have much choice. It's not as if Israel chose war. Israel was forced into war by a surprise attack and had to go into a war. When you do such thing, you have a very wide range of considerations that you must apply. I've been in recent months, I've been sitting with one of the, I won't say who this is, but one of the main decision makers in Israel during the first month of the war. I've been sitting with him, advising him as he's writing a book. His, a book of his memoir on the first month of the war. So it's like sitting on the shoulder of someone who makes such decisions, trying to understand what are the things that he must consider as he looks. I'll give one example. Okay, on October 11th, one of the most dramatic decisions by the Israeli government at the early stages of the war was made on October 11th, when there was a big debate within the government, essentially between the Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, and the Prime Minister Netanyahu, as to whether Israel should strike first in the north or in the south. Some people, including the Prime Minister, including former Chief of Staff Eisenkot and others, said we must go to the south because we were attacked by Hamas. The world and the Israeli public aren't going to understand what we're doing if we don't go first to strike in the south. And some people, including the defense minister and to a certain extent the chief of staff of the IDF, Herzi Halevi, and to some extent the chief of Mossad, said no, we should start by attacking Hezbollah in the north first. Why? Because this is counterintuitive. It will be a surprise attack. It will turn the tide immediately. There were many arguments for and against the two options. Now, when you consider such two options, you must think about the preparedness of the IDF, public opinion in Israel, public opinion around the world, the view of the Biden administration, the way Hezbollah is prepared or unprepared for an Israeli attack, the way Iran is going to respond to an attack in the south. There are at least 20 questions that you must answer. Among them is the way this could impact the American Jewish community. On such decision, this is a minor consideration. In other instances, this could be a more significant consideration. You must take this into account, but you, as someone who sits here, must understand that if you are the Israeli prime minister or an Israeli member of the cabinet, that's not the only question on your mind. You might say, well, I well understand that this could have negative impact on American Jewish students on campus. Then again, I'm fighting for the survival of Israel now, and I'm going to push this question to the side for the moment, and I'll deal with it later. And right now, I'm going to do what is the most essential thing that Israel must do. So again, if my comments were understood to mean that, it doesn't matter for Israel whether American Jews suffer or are implicated, that's not at all my intention. In fact, the institute of which I'm a member, the Jewish People Policy Institute, almost every year we recommend to the cabinet to enhance the level of their understanding of the impact of Israeli actions on world Jewry. It is essentially important. But the fact that it's essentially important doesn't mean that it's the only thing that's important. And we must put things in proportion. When you face a barrage of 200 missiles coming in from Iran, what American students feel on campuses would not be your first consideration.
So I have some bad news, which is we are not only out of time, but we might be evicted here. So we don't have more time for questions, but I want to thank our panelists for a very spirited discussion. And before you leave, I know it's asking a lot, but we just have some very, very brief comments by our conference co-organizers. So Lauren Strauss and Professor Michael Brenner. Professor Lauren Strauss.
Well, first of all, thank you all. I know there were many more hands up, and especially we have a lot of students here, so I feel bad about it, but we have to leave this room in about 20 minutes, the whole hall, so if we start taking more questions, we won't, we can't do that. I want to just make one, first of all, thank you, and I'll say my thanks in a minute. I want to make one comment because I think it was really an important thing that Shmuel raised about the composition of speakers. That always comes up, and you're right. You're absolutely right. We do not have a representative group of speakers, including not 15% Haredi speakers or 20% Arab Israeli speakers. But I hear and I hear it, and also not probably the amount of whatever right of center. I hear the same, by the way, from the other direction. One of the questions I always get, is Peter Beinart coming? And are people coming like JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, who are anti-Zionist? In 1998, I organized, I think, the first major conference on Israel. It was 50 years. It wasn't here. It was in Germany. We had 10 members of Knesset, including Haredi, settlers, and Yael Dayan, and left wing, and Arab speakers. Unfortunately, I think we're in a different time, and what I think as an academic institution we're doing is to first of all, we bring the best speakers, of course, that's for sure. But we do have a range of opinions, and I admit it could be maybe larger, it could be somewhere else, but a range of opinions, but also common ground. And the idea is that we have discussions like these, where we really can discuss and not just debates or shouting matches like a lot of Israeli talk shows, where you can't finish a sentence. So I will
Or the Knesset.
I will think again, and I think for next year, whatever the topic is, but it's always a big question, how much common ground do you need? And I think what we really thought for most of the panels anyway is to really invite first-rate academics and have a spectrum of opinions and have also a spectrum of opinions in the audience. So that was important to me to say, and I think was an important point. Having said that, it is my privilege to thank all the speakers that were here. Many people in the room who have been here for 9 hours, since 8:30 in the morning. Really wonderful debates, great moderators. And of course, all the people who helped us make this possible. I see Eric Gordon, who's a big part, who nobody knows is here, but everybody on Zoom and everybody relying on the technical equipment, all of our interns who have been here all day, the people who manage the room, the security, unfortunately, also, people responsible for great food, and of course, I want to thank Davida Yitzhaki. For those of you who know, who remember, 16 years we had Laura Cutler. You know, she was a wonderful person to organize these things. It was always around her birthday that we did this. And I said, happy birthday. Happy birthday, Davida, because it's also her birthday over this weekend. It was the only reason we choose you, of course. So thank you. And of course, Lauren. I want to thank one person who's not here tonight, because Pamela Nadell, whose name came up a lot, my dear colleague, she was also instrumental in bringing some of the speakers in. She's on a book tour. She's in San Diego today. She would have loved to be here. And of course, Lauren Strauss. Lauren, you really came with this idea of the conference about a year ago, and you took almost all of the steps to implement it. So thank you, and thank you all. And maybe you want to have the last word.
Last word. Not too many. I do particularly want to thank the people who have been here all day and also last night. And for those of you who may have missed some of our amazing sessions, they were all recorded. Thank you, Eric Gordon and your team. And hopefully they will be up on our website in not too long from now. And I encourage you to share them, because there was so much wisdom and just beautifully articulated thoughts about this relationship, about the profound moment that we're in. And I know that I'm going to go back and listen to my colleagues again and again. So I want to thank you all who were on this panel. Thank you all who remain in the room who were on earlier panels. Thank you, Michael, for giving me this opportunity to plan this conference. You know this has been my passion for a very long time. And again, thank the Meltzer and Trone families for supporting this conference. And please fill out the evaluation form that you will get in an email from us. It will be really helpful. So we really appreciate that. Good night, and good luck in the traffic.